This is a re-recording of presentations made in July of 2013 in La Junta and Canyon City related to the BMP Toolbox prepared for the Southeastern Colorado Water Conservancy District. The BMP Toolbox was prepared as a means to bring together a lot of different information that has been available on various locations throughout the country. And the reason we put the BMP Toolbox together was to provide a resource that is accessible. So we wanted to bring all these different parts of content together into one location that was accessible, was navigable, would be evolving, because we know that over time we're going to be getting more information that folks are going to be interested in accessing. And then, as said earlier, it's a compendium of works by others. There's many other, there was so much available content that we wanted to be able to have all of these things brought into one single location. And one other component of the toolbox that was very important was that we wanted to depict the integration of utility business operations with developing water conservation and water use efficiency tools. Now, the reason this was conducted is that the toolbox was developed as an outgrowth of the district's Regional Water Conservation Plan. And the Regional Water Conservation Plan was developed as a requirement from the Bureau of Reclamation for the support of the Arkansas Valley Conduit and related projects. The concept of the toolbox is to create a web-based support for the project partners and participants, and it's supported by the Bureau of Reclamation, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and the Colorado Waterwise. It's important to note at this point that the toolbox, although it was specifically created as part of an outgrowth of the Regional Water Conservation Plan, the intent is to create a toolbox that is going to be utilized by a large group of folks beyond simply the members and the participants in the Arkansas Valley Conduit and related projects. And for that reason, the support that was provided to the district exceeded simply those folks in local areas. And that's one of the reasons why there's been a great interest by Colorado Water Conservation Board and its members. The website itself sits on the district's website within all of its content. The key pieces of information that are included within the toolbox include the Colorado Waterwise Guidebook for Best Practices for Municipal Water Conservation, the AWWA Programs and Research, the American Water Works Association. We'll talk more about that in a moment. It also includes some of the new CWCB policy work related to the SWASI water conservation levels, which talks about moving away from simply doing customer demand management type water conservation into more business and enterprise related components of utility operations. There was, during the preparation of the Regional Water Conservation Plan, there were interviews conducted with the 38 Arkansas Valley Conduit project participants, and their needs related to water conservation and water use efficiency greatly shaped the way that the toolbox was conceived and constructed. And then it was also supported by discussions with the Conservation Board's Legislative Committee, which is the Water Conservation Technical Advisory Group. And all of those different components informed how the toolbox was created. The concept of the toolbox was to support water utility and water company planning, operations, and customer outreach and education. So it really is an integrated approach to trying to promote and support meaningful water conservation. And the overarching theme has to do with how the business model of water utilities and water companies are integrated into all the different components of water conservation and how water conservation is integrated into the business model. So that's why the toolbox not only is important from a support for project participants in their planning, but also may have some relevance to folks outside of the district's service area. So what is water conservation planning and how does the toolbox play into it? Well, we know we begin with the Regional Water Conservation Plan. We have funding and other resources, and those things come into the individual conservation plan development. From the Regional Water Conservation Plan, there are guidelines that are provided within the district's plan. There's support that's going to be provided in terms of implementing that plan by the district staff and resources. And then once, as the plan is being implemented, there's going to be a reporting mechanism between the project partners and the district that will create a more comprehensive understanding of how the plan is being implemented both on a regional and local scale. From the funding aspect, we know that we've got opportunities to access funding for developing local plans as well as implementing from reclamation, the Water Conservation Board, the Department of Local Affairs, and there's other resources associated with the Colorado Rural Water Authority, so that we've got those different locations where we have funding resources. And if we bring those together, it comes into the development of individual water conservation plans required within a appropriate water conservation plan at the local level are, first off, what goals? Why would anyone want to do water conservation planning, and what are you trying to achieve? The toolbox is set up to help local water utilities and companies make decisions as to what kinds of goals are reasonable for their circumstance. The next thing is what programs. If you're going to, once you've set goals, you're going to select programs that are going to help achieve those goals. How do you do water conservation? Again, that's something that's provided in the toolbox. And then finally, implementation, where you're doing monitoring, verification of you know, if you're spending money, you want to know if you're actually achieving the ends that you set out to do. When are those things going to happen? Again, the toolbox is set up to try and help in that area as well. Very much data collection and data management are key components of not only the water conservation planning, but how business is operated at a utility or a company. And those are integral, as you'll see later on, to how the toolbox has been set up. Now, an example of how the toolbox has been prepared is through the M36 Water Audits and Water Loss Control. This is a document that is available through the American Water Works Association, and it is their Bible, so to speak, on a manual of water supply practices, and in particular for water audits and water loss control. And so what we did is we went into that resource and made it as accessible through the toolbox to provide folks with insight as to how water audits and water loss control can be conducted. At no point was it indicated that they had to be conducted. It was more, here are how audits and water loss control programs could fit into the planning, budgeting, benchmarking, and business decision making that affect all utilities and water companies. So this is an example of how the toolbox provides kind of a backbone or a framework within which organizations can then evaluate what they may want to do with respect to future planning and then implementation. So the key component of water loss has to do with looking at non-revenue versus unaccounted for water. Unaccounted for water is a term of art that is not well established, meaning that unaccounted for water is not well defined. So we're moving totally towards non-revenue water, and the bars that you see on the graphic here are data that was provided by all 38 Arkansas Valley conduit participants during the water audit that were performed during preparation of the Regional Water Conservation Plan. And what was provided was the water that's produced, which is the bar on the left, and the water sold on a monthly basis. And the difference between those two is non-revenue water. Now, if you take a look at the non-revenue water, that is broken into these three areas: unbilled authorized consumption, which could be things like town parks who are using water but aren't being charged for it, city shops, we know of some churches, some cemeteries that may fit into that area, unbilled authorized consumption. So those are areas where we have some understanding perhaps of some of those uses might be metered, some of them may be unmetered. Then anything aside from the unbilled authorized consumption are water losses, and those are divided into apparent losses and real losses. Apparent losses could be things like water theft. Somebody goes and opens up a water hydrant, fire hydrant in the summertime and lets all the kids run around and get cooled off. That's kind of a water theft, and it's an apparent loss. Another apparent loss would be meters that aren't reading correctly. As meters age, they tend to read low rather than high. So over time, having meters that are inaccurate is an apparent loss, not a real loss. The real losses, therefore, are everything else. So an example of a metric that the American Water Works Association is trying to get folks to calculate is something called CARL, Current Annual Real Losses. And this is calculated as total non-revenue water minus unbilled authorized consumption minus apparent losses. And that comes up with CARL. So the first thing that organizations can do is spend time collecting the data to help identify what CARL is, because right now we're seeing that most utilities, not just in Colorado but throughout the United States, do not have all the data they may need simply to characterize CARL. Folks can make assumptions, and even when we've got a substantial amount of data that has been collected, there's still going to be some estimating that's going to take place at this point. But the more data that we collect, the better we can characterize what the actual current annual real losses are, because once we've got that understood, we have the opportunity to begin to make some business decisions as to how to manage CARL. So the next thing we want to do with respect to collecting data and making an assessment of business decisions related to water loss is to look at the real losses, because it's broke down into two different sections. One is unavoidable annual real loss. Every water or every infrastructure is going to have some unavoidable annual real loss. It's just inherent in the systems with all the pipe and the meters and the connections that are in the ground. So there's this, one of the things we want to try and calculate is what the unavoidable annual real losses are. There is a calculation that American Water Works Association has, which is a function of the miles of pipe, the number of connections, the system pressure, the number of hydrants and the length of hydrant lines, and the length of service lines that is put into this empirical calculation that helps to estimate what an unavoidable annual real loss might be. And so this is another calculation that would be of some benefit. So once we've got these two different numbers, unavoidable annual real loss and CARL, the current annual real loss calculated, we can begin to look at a specific number that is called the ILI, or the Infrastructure Leak Index, which is this first bullet, it's a comparison of the ratio of current annual water loss to avoidable water loss. And what that basically tells us is that it tells us about the ratio of the real losses, the two boxes on the right down at the bottom by unavoidable annual real loss. Once we have an idea and an understanding of what our ratio between current and avoidable water loss is, we can begin to look at the economic level of leakage. How much does an organization want to spend to repair and replace water lines and manage water loss control versus how much leakage is acceptable. And that becomes a business decision. It's different with every organization. It's dependent on the economic decision-making components, and those are choices that a water utility board or a city council will be able to make, but they need to have the data to be able to do that. And that's why the toolbox is set up the way it is. It's set up to basically show, here's the data that the organizations can choose to acquire such that they can best understand their own water losses, what's avoidable and what's current, and then make decisions on how much money and resources to put into those things. That can very much be what is a component of a local water conservation plan, is collecting that data and then managing that data and then making decisions related to that data. So there are 4 pillars of water loss control that all organizations can look at to support decision-making on investment choices and characterizing this economic level of leakage. And these are the 4 pillars. Pressure management, which is working through the system, make sure there aren't places where there are very high pressures. Active leak detection, as opposed to having passive leak detection where all of your leaks are found through customers who give a call to the utility and say, you know, we noticed that there's water coming up out of the street or out in the field. Going to an active leak detection system where you're looking at different kinds of listening devices and technologies for going out at 3 in the morning to see if you can hear leaks, for example. There's examples of active leak detection in the toolbox. Speed and quality of repairs. One of the things that we've heard is that the amount of breaks in a pipeline is not necessarily dependent on the materials of the pipeline or even the age of the pipeline so much as the quality of the craftsmanship at the time the pipeline was built. And so the speed and the quality of the repairs plays very much into the real water loss that will be realized. And then finally, the way pipeline and assets are managed, installation, maintenance, renewal, all of these things, all 4 pillars have, there's an implication related to cost and the ability or the value to a utility or water company to actually invest in these things to reduce real water loss, because real water loss is broken into these 3 areas. We have that unavoidable annual real water loss. We have a level of real water loss that's economically reasonable, so we're willing to let a certain amount of water loss occur. Even though it's not unavoidable, it's too expensive to capture. And then finally, there's that potential recoverable real losses. One other point I want to make at this juncture is going back to this acronym ILI, the Infrastructure Leakage Index, is that index is something that is becoming a standard metric that is being used in states throughout the country to track how different utilities are doing with respect to that comparison of current annual real loss to unavoidable. And by having that metric, and it's being done in Georgia, it's being done in New Mexico, it's being looked at in Texas, having that metric allows different utilities to compare themselves and benchmark against how utilities of similar size and circumstance are performing. And another very important component of the toolbox has to do with benchmarking and providing data to utilities and boards and city councils with respect to what other organizations are doing and realizing. And so the last piece that I want to state with respect to the American Water Works Association water loss control programs are that if we can start to get everybody not only to collecting the data that allows them to manage their real loss, but then reporting it in a consistent fashion, that not only gets folks to do better at management of real loss, but it also provides benchmarking information that other organizations can benefit from. So you can see how the toolbox is supporting how organizations move forward with understanding what they have and then making better informed economic decisions. That's really the crux to the entire program. And this, therefore, final slide, the 4 pillars, it's how much to spend, when to spend it, and then part of the idea of the water conservation planning is that we'll find opportunities to bring funding in to support those components of water conservation planning that are being chosen to implement. So what we want to do now is we want to go and dive into the best management practice toolbox. There are 5 components to it, and what we'll do is rather than go to the PowerPoint, we'll shift over to the website. So this is the website. The landing page on the website is the district's website, which is shown up here, www.secwcd.org. And the toolbox is under the Conservation and Education, and then the Water Conservation BMP Toolbox. You can see that the toolbox is, in terms of trying to be navigable, we have 5 different parts of the toolbox. We have the water system management, we have the water production and treatment, water distribution, water delivery to customers, and customer water use. And each one of these has its own set of best practices related to it. So why don't we just start at the beginning and go into the water system management. When you click on that component, you get the sidebar comes up, which you can then click on, and that will get you into the content for any specific part of the toolbox. What we've done with water system management, which is the overarching part of the any kind of planning, is we have it broken into 2 sections, water utility management and system operations. Water utility management, as you can see, is a lot of different issues that may arise with respect to how water utilities are operating. In fact, when we went out and talked to the 38 project participants, they told us that they were worried about maintaining board members because a number of folks were retiring and they were having trouble recruiting board members. So we have staff and board recruitment that we're taking a look at. We have issues with some nonprofits that exist, and they were wondering if they should become special districts or they should do something else, and they came up as the organizational structure and contracting. Effective utility management is really talks about strategic planning at a utility. We talked earlier about benchmarking and how important that was. We have an entire section related to how to benchmark and resources related to that. But one that I really want to click on here is the planning section. And this is the kinds of plans that water utilities will be looking at. And most utilities are already doing this. The vast majority already are, although in some smaller organizations they may not be written down. There's still understanding what to be done, what needs to be done in each of these areas: annual budgeting, facility assessment and capital improvement planning, water supply planning, water conservation planning, drought response planning. And if you hit on any one of these, for example, drought response planning, what comes up is a brief discussion of what it is and then some resources. Here's the CWCB Municipal Drought Management Plan Toolbox. Kansas Water Office has some excellent drought resources, so those are embedded in here. And then the other thing that we'd like to do is leave you with the impression that all of these plans are integrated, in that doing just the water conservation plan by itself will not provide meaningful water conservation without some kind of integration into budgeting, such that there's money available to do the planning, water supply planning, because the water conservation plan may change either supply or demand management issues, and that may change what a water supply portfolio needs to look like. Dealing with water rates and fees. We know that if we've got changing customer water use, it may change revenue streams, and we need to take account of that in the water rates. So all of these things need to be integrated, and having them all in one place here will help give an impression to someone who's looking at water conservation planning how much integration there has to be. So that's the water utility management side of things. If we go back to system operations and we look at what all utilities are doing at a general level, the first thing we know they're doing is data collection. And the data collection involves volume of water. It's either produced or distributed, costs, utility billings, infrastructure. There's also something about about data collection and data management under every one of these other individual components of the toolbox. The water loss control is something we've been talking about, and I'll just go into there. This shows the water audit methodology and how data can be analyzed, and the water balance calculation, which is exactly what we've been talking about earlier. Here's information as to what goes on with water loss control and some background. And if you go into data analysis, you can see that we show a simplified water balance related to data that's collected from an audit. And at the bottom, you'll see that we calculate current annual real losses, CARL, and non-revenue water, just like the presentation discussed earlier. So that's the system management, and there's quite a bit of information in there, but we tried to keep each of the pages fairly brief, although this one's a little over a page long. Most of the pages are less than that. If we go into water production and treatment, you can see that here we have just data collection and management and alternative water supply options. Those are the only things that show up in here. And to give you a sense of the kind of the breadth of information that's provided is that we talk about these different alternative water supply options. We give some indication as to what each of them may be and how they might be applicable to situations that any individual out in the valley might have. We also have links into the State Engineer's Office for obvious reasons. Distribution begins again with data collection. Pressure management, leak detection and repair. This is one spot I want to spend just a moment on, in that one of the more important components we felt with respect to leak detection and repair is how we actually, what we do, but another very important is the data collection related to leak detection and repair. And what we're recommending is during leak detection reporting that this type of information is collected. And I think most folks collect it: date, the crew, the staff that reports it and witnesses the leak, the location. I'm just reading down the list. Leak number, what type of leak, but as you get to the very bottom, how leak was discovered, trying to track whether it was actively found through listening devices or whether it was customer complaints and observations. Because moving away from discovering leaks that are proactive versus reactive may become a metric that your organization wants to collect. This is very simple data to record, and as long as you've got the data over, then you can make assessment of changes of practices over time. So it's the data collection that becomes really the key. And then once we've, because this toolbox is going to be around for many years, as we collect the data and we do it in a consistent fashion, not only within a utility, but from utility to utility, that can support better planning and it can support better decision making, which goes right back to the benchmarking components that we talked about under system management. We'll take a look at delivery, which is basically delivery of water to customers. Again, data collection and management's front and center. We have a whole section on meter testing, repair, and replacement. and then related meter infrastructure, which relates to meter yokes. Also, we have a lot of expected issues with meters that aren't recording the very low flows associated with perhaps some of our older homes and residences that may have a very slow leak in a toilet or a dripping sink. Those low flows, a gallon per hour, aren't necessarily recorded in a meter, especially a meter that is mechanical versus electromagnetic. But even the electromagnetic meters have issues with reading at those very low flows. There are unmeasured flow reducers that have been developed that can help to batch that very low flow and get the meter to actually record it. And although this may not be something that's economically feasible, at least the information is here for decision making, and it gives some cost points and it gives some resources for where those kinds of devices can be purchased. And then we have backflow prevention and pressure reducing valves. So you can see that there's quite a breadth in here of information that can be utilized by planning organizations and what have you. Then the last part, the fifth section of the toolbox, is the customer water use, which is the space where most of past water conservation practices and focus has been in the state of Colorado as well as throughout the U.S. And so we have links into the best management practices or the best practices for municipal conservation in Colorado, which is from the WaterWise. We have under landscape management an entire section. We have the Green Co., which is the Green Colorado, or the Green Industries of Colorado BMP manual. So we have all these different components where you can just go and pull up content from other sources. Here's an example under managing existing landscapes, a BP9 for water efficiency design and installation. And if you click on that, up will come a PDF of that practice directly from the Colorado WaterWise guidebook. So we've got a lot of different ways in which to access these pieces of support for planning purposes. The other thing I just bring to your attention is down at the bottom of every single page that we've got is a way to create a PDF, so you can either or send it by email, you can create a hard copy, or you can grab text out of these different pages in the toolbox and then paste them into a document. So we tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. One other thing, the last thing I want to show with respect to the toolbox is that we do have a whole section on policy and regulation, and you can see that it does cover areas of water waste ordinance, but it also includes water rates, conservation-oriented water rates versus water rate studies, which is up in the system management. Conservation-oriented water rates is a best practice that may fit into customer water use management as opposed to setting rates in general. There's obviously a connection between the two. Landscape water budgets is also policy and regulation, new landscape design installation requirements, and new indoor construction requirements. All of these things are policies, and within each one of these, you'll find that there are other connections into best practices within the Colorado WaterWise Guidebook. So that's an overview of the entire toolbox, which you can get back to through this breadcrumb at the top, and how it's navigated. So what we want to do is go back to the PowerPoint and talk about what's going to happen in the future. Well, the first thing is that we're looking for anyone and everyone to give a review and kind of walk through the toolbox, and at any point provide your thoughts, comments, identification of resources that could be included in the toolbox, and get them to the district such that the website can be improved and the toolbox can be expanded. One of the big things that we're hoping is that over time, as folks do certain things, let's say that a particular water company does a water rate study, they may provide that resource, an RFP, or maybe the study itself as a PDF that can then be linked into the toolbox. So we're looking for ways for the toolbox to be expanded and enhanced. So that's one of the things that we're looking for. We're also, through the process of implementation of the regional plan, we're going to see more local planning. We're going to see additional data collection and management, and those kinds of things are going to happen not only on the local level but also by the district, and the district will be providing the technical assistance and some of the messaging as the regional plan is implemented. So those are the different things we see happening. You know, improved local planning and more local planning, coordination of data collection and data reporting by all the participants back into the district. That'll support local, you know, benchmarking and things like that. And then there's consistency in the way the toolbox is used and the technical assistance provided by the district. So that's kind of an overview. One of the things that folks should be aware of is that the time frame for implementation of the regional plan is, you know, we're looking at potentially seeing the construction and beginning of operation in 2022 of the Arkansas Valley Conduit. So by that time, we may have contracts that will incorporate components of water use efficiency and local planning. The goals the district have set up are for achievement by the year 2030 and 2050. So those also, you can see, are very long-term goals over the coming decades. So this is something that's going to be in place for a long time, and the data collection and the technical assistance will be there throughout that entire process. In the short term, however, we want to see from the district connecting into the project participants, beginning to collect the data related to the things that happened during the preparation of the Regional Water Conservation Plan beginning in 2014. So we want to see monthly production data, monthly sales and delivery of water. So it's not how much money, but it's how much water was delivered. That will happen by customer category. Those two pieces of information, monthly production, monthly sales, begins January 2014, and then it continues monthly through 2014, such that it's actually reported to the district in the first quarter 2015. And we want to make sure folks know that they need to collect it such that they can report it, although when we did our audits back a few years ago, we found that everybody was collecting this data, which is part of the reason why it's listed here, because we knew that this was already in everyone's standard practice. The non-revenue water will be calculated from the data that's provided on production and sales. We do need to get the number of customer connections. We'd also like to get that by customer category. Another thing that we'd like is to get your water rates, including the service or base fee and cost of water, and if there are different rates for different customer types, we'd like to know that as well. And then this last one, the status of water conservation planning. We're not saying that anybody needs to do a plan. We just want to know if you are, and excuse me, and if you are doing a plan, you know, it's yes, and if you aren't, it's no. If you are doing a plan, the other thing that the district very much would like to know is what programs are you implementing, because it's not a question of are you implementing the right things. We want to find out who's implementing what, because that becomes important in terms of communications to all the other folks who are doing local planning, because they may want to see what you're doing and may want to try and follow your lead, get some data from you with respect to what kinds of successes you're having and what kind of challenges you're running into. Just a quick aside, a couple of these things are already being looked at as enhancements to the toolbox. One is that when we went out and spoke during these workshops in La Junta and Canyon City, folks wanted to see what the current water rates that everybody have in the valley, so they can use that information in discussions with their boards and their city councils. So we're trying to develop a list of current water rates, but obviously we want to keep that updated in time. And then another one is the status of water conservation planning It's really going to be trying to look at what folks are doing, and that information is provided through another link already on the district website that provides a PDF of not only the Regional Water Conservation Plan, but all the local plans that have been developed, like St. Charles Mesa, Lamar, and La Junta. So those are where we're at with respect to not only what the toolbox looks like currently, where the toolbox is going to be evolving to into the future, and then the specific data collection. The last thing I would say is if you have any questions, or if you have comments or review resources you want to provide, there's a link on the landing page of the BMP Toolbox, which gives the contact right back to Jean, so you can get her email and send her comments, because we're updating the toolbox on a regular basis, in part because of the way that the toolbox was designed. It makes it very easy to do that. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to you visiting the toolbox in the future.